Hello and good morning from where I am. It is Kristi, and after a quick error with the sound, I am back on with the correct hangout. And in this episode, we're going to continue on with reading from my doctoral thesis. In the last video, we had the first results that tested the hypothesis that agency would be related to somebody's propensity to report that they intended to vote if there were an election held that day. And what this chapter is basically going through other turnout models that were published by the British election study team. And those are the principal investigators. I was on the 2005 study. I was actually the senior research officer on that study. So I was able to watch them do that process. But yeah, in terms of the book, they wrote the book because they were the guys who got it. I got to mention the credits, which was nice. But I'm replicating their work. It's always handy when your PhD supervisor is a leader in the field because you can just ask him questions if you have any. And it was very easy to replicate their work. If I had any questions, I could just go into David's office and have a chat, and he would tell me, the best way to operationalize my data to fit with their theories. So continuing on with the evaluation of the role of these gendered attitude measures for agency in communion on people's self-reported intention to vote, if I'm being entirely accurate. Let's go ahead and swap over and continue on. So I've got with me today a cup of tea. Hopefully it'll stop me from coughing as much, and occasionally I might just have a little bit of a pause where there's silence, and that's going to be me taking a little sip off of my cuppa like I'm going to do right now. The second model tested by the British election study team was the social capital model. This theory states that institutions and groups generate outputs desired by the individual, thereby producing higher levels of trust. Unfortunately, space constraints in our survey instrument precluded the replication of measures that tap into a respondent's participation in voluntary associations and their attitude on issues of people's trustworthiness. The next model, civic volunteerism, was partially replicated in our dataset. Civic volunteerism is grounded in measures of psychology and in social characteristics and their context, all of which provide resources to increase individuals' political information and skills. Civic volunteerism uses measures of psychology and holds that an individual's social context and social characteristics provide resources to increase that individual's political skills and knowledge of political information. It is hypothesized that these skill sets allow people to act politically and be more politically engaged. The fundamental components of the civil volunteerism model are a person's level of education, their income and other resources, and their participation in social groups or other associations that would provide them with a forum for political action. Earlier studies of civic volunteerism posited that individuals who are more interested in politics feel more politically efficacious, and that those who hold strong ideological and/or partisan attachments are more likely to be politically active. The civic volunteerism model used by Clark et al. Is voting is some function of a constant plus the resources you have available to you, the index of recruitment by others and political parties, the extent of voluntary activity, one's own sense of one's political efficacy, interest in the election, strength of party identification, plus all of the demographic control variables. Applying a binomial logit analysis to these variables using 2001 data, the BES team produced results in which, of all the variables used in the analysis, 3 measures were statistically insignificant: education, leisure time, and respondents' recruitment. All the significant variables had a positive effect on intention to vote, with the exception of their gender, their sex variable, which produced a negative value, indicating women were more likely to vote than men. Their model produced a McFadden's R-square of 0.15. Insofar as I could replicate this model with my own data, my civic volunteerism model was specified as voting is some function of a constant plus resources, self-rated interest in politics, strength of party identification, and the totaling up of the demographic variables. The results of my analyses are displayed in Table 4.2. In my results, the power of an individual's strength of partisan identification, 0.96, their interest in politics, beta equals 0.68, and type of work they do, 0.60, dominate the other variables in the model in terms of accounting for the variance in intention to vote. Similar to the results of the British election study team, my results indicate that social grade has a positive association with reported likelihood of intention to vote, as does higher levels of self-reported interest in politics and having a strong partisan identification. In contrast to the British election studies results, a respondent's age is not statistically significant in my analysis. In Model 1 of the replicated results in Table 4.2, the sex variable is insignificant. Model 2 offers virtually no improvement on Model 1 in terms of the variance explained. The pseudo R-squared measures range between 13 and 25% for both models, and neither the sex variable nor any of the gender variables are significant. Therefore, this result is evidenced against H1, an individual's measure of agency would have a positive, statistically significant effect on intention to vote in every model in which it is included. So here are the results, and as you can see, in my replicated version, there was no statistically significant sex effects, no matter what I did. And to be honest, the reason for that is, if we look at here the size of the XB, which is it's a way to calculate the odds ratio of how likely, how much you're improving based on this, or in terms of reporting you were going to turn out or not. What we have here is, you can see strength of party ID is at basically 2 times, it increases it, and that generally means that a lot of the variance is being picked up by the strength of party identification rather than by my measures, because party identification basically trumps most things in the model. If you're trying to understand why people vote, the variance explained by their strength of party identification goes a long way to explaining that just by itself. So there's very little room left to kind of, fill up the rest of the variance. Other variables look smaller. So that's fine. I mean, one negative finding is still a finding. We know where the measure doesn't work, but as we'll see, the measure is much better at being explaining the attitudes that mediate a lot of these behaviors, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. The next model attempts to replicate one of the theories tested by Clark et al., categorized under the individual rationality framework. Models under the individual rationality framework are grounded in the assumption that decision-making is motivated by a core expected utility model, although the models employed by Clark et al. Do not make the, quote, severe demands on decision-making, unquote, that more stringent models of rationality would. The British election study team's individual rationality framework contains 3 different models of turnout. 1, the cognitive mobilization model, 2, the minimal rational choice model, and 3, the general incentives model. Unfortunately, with my dataset, I can only replicate the cognitive mobilization model. Clark et al. Offer 2 observations regarding cognitive mobilization developments. One states that in recent times, people have had easier access to higher education and forms of mass communication, which has improved their ability to digest political information. The other claims that, as a result of the rise of electronic, print, and internet media, the cost of acquiring political and other information has decreased. According to this account, the resulting increase in the political sophistication of the electorate produces the concomitant effect of increasing their dissatisfaction with the incumbent government, and as a consequence, the chance of protest voting. Clark et al. Used the cognitive mobilization model as a prediction of turnout in order to test whether the hypothesized disaffection created by an increase in political understanding has the effect of decreasing or increasing the likelihood of voting. The independent variables for the cognitive mobilization model are measures of education, media consumption, political interest, and knowledge and attitudes toward government policies. Clark et al. Operationalized the cognitive mobilization model as such. Pause for a sip of tea. Voting intention is some function of a constant plus their education, the coefficient that represents the effect of their educational attainment, exposure to media coverage of the election, interest in the election, information relative to voting, extent of dissatisfaction with the government's policies, and adding up the demographic variable coefficients. The results of the analysis conducted by Clark et al. Indicate that interest in the election had a large positive effect on the likelihood of voting. Sex had a statistically significant effect such that women were more likely to turn out in 2001. Political knowledge and paying attention to the campaign were associated with an increase in turnout, as was the respondents' age. Policy dissatisfaction and was associated with a decreased likelihood to vote. The cognitive mobilization model produced a McFadden's R-square of 0.15. I was able to replicate much of this model using similar variables in my dataset. My modified cognitive mobilization model is voting is some function of a constant plus the coefficient that measures the effective age at which they left education, what, if any, media they were consuming, self-rated interest in politics, their score on political knowledge quiz, and adding up the coefficients of the effects for the various control variables. The results for Model 1 and 2 are displayed in Table 4.3 below. Analysis shows that, similar to the results above, interest in politics increased our respondents' likelihood of reporting they would vote if an election were held that day, 0.81. Media consumption was not statistically significant, nor was the sex variable in this model. Higher scores on the measures of political knowledge had a positive effect on the likelihood of reporting that the respondent would vote, 0.49, as did the age variable, 0.01. Overall, between 0.08 and 0.18% of the variance in intention to vote was accounted for by the variables in my cognitive mobilization model, in line with the McFadden R-squared of 0.15, reported by the British Election Study team. Inclusion of the gender variables in Model 2 did not increase the overall variance explained. The variance explained is identical in both models. But the inclusion of the measure for agency produced a coefficient which was statistically significant and positive, 0.16, as predicted by H1. The coefficients in the model were stable for the most part, and the measure of biological sex remained statistically insignificant in Model 2. This result is evidence in support of H1, which predicts agency will have a positive and statistically significant effect on an individual's likelihood of indicating that they would vote. So here is the cognitive mobilization model. There's 4.3. As you can see here, in both models, sex is statistically insignificant, but when it comes to agency, it becomes statistically significant, and it has a positive effect on people's on the dependent variable, explaining the variance in the dependent variable of reporting that they would be likely to turn out. Conclusion of my intention to vote analysis. Thus far, I have replicated several models used to analyze turnout behavior using 2001 data. Although many of my measures are similar to the measures used by the British Election Study, the survey measures themselves are not entirely comparable. For instance, our survey was conducted long after and long before a general election. Given the mobilizing nature of campaigns and the media coverage of them, respondents who may indeed vote in elections could have reported otherwise when our survey was conducted. Our measure of hypothetical turnout is not entirely comparable to measures of turnout asked in post-election surveys. However, even noting this difference, for the most part, the results using the exploratory data are quite similar to those of Clark et al., with the noted exception that women in my dataset are less likely to indicate they would vote than women surveyed following the 2001 general election. More importantly for this thesis were tests of the relationship between the concept of agency and reported likelihood to vote. In 2 of the 3 models in which agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability were included in the analysis, the equity, fairness, and cognitive mobilization models, the agency variable produced positive and statistically significant results in support of H1. The inclusion of agency had small effects in those 2 models. Including the gender measures in the equity fairness produced a statistically significant positive coefficient for the agency variable, and reduces the size of the sex coefficient. The cognitive mobilization model revealed that agency, when included in the analysis, did have a positive and statistically significant effect, and as a control variable, slightly reduced the effects of interest in politics. Excuse me for just a second. Still can't get over this cold. Inclusion of the measure of agency into the civic volunteerism model did not produce any statistically significant results for the measure of agency, as most of the variance in intention to vote was accounted for through the measures of strength of partisan identification and interest in politics. The next section will narrow its focus to examine the relationship between sex, gender, and partisan vote choice for voters who indicated they would vote for the Labor versus other voters, and for Labor, not the Labor, vote for Labor versus other voters, and voters who indicated they would vote for the Conservatives versus other voters, to determine if and where sex and gender can help us better understand an individual's partisan preferences. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the vote choice section here. It'd be nice to get a good whack out of this as we proceed, but I really do need to take a sip of tea, so hold on a second, you guys. Right, oh, that's so much better. It would only be better if it was in my Shaun the Sheep mug, but that one I didn't clean out, so sad face, but that's the only thing that could make that tea better. Right, getting on to vote choice. The analysis of intention to vote indicates that in certain models, there was a relationship between an individual's sense of agency and the likelihood they would report they would vote or not. This section focuses upon the role of sex and gender in an individual's vote choice. More specifically, it investigates whether sex and gender have an effect on whether an individual indicates they support the Labour or Conservative parties. Chapter 1 reviewed the longitudinal evidence demonstrating that women have historically supported the Conservative Party in Britain. The chapter reported that women's conservative support splits by generations and has overall trended downwards over the years, eventually transitioning for women by and large preferring the Conservative Party to older women continuing to lean conservative, whilst younger women voters supported the Labour Party under Tony Blair. Pippa Norris's gender generation gap theory is grounded in the observation that younger women in Britain are more likely to vote for the Labour Party than younger men, and older women are more likely to support the Conservative Party than older men. Do sex and gender matter in an individual's vote choice in this exploratory dataset? Informed by theory, it is possible to make predictions as to the impact of measures of agency and communion on vote choice, with emotional vulnerability included as a control variable as per the recommendation of Ward et al. As noted throughout, agency is associated with autonomy and a sense of personal efficacy. Traditionally, the Conservative Party has espoused political positions which mirror this highly agentic perspective. Labour, on the other hand, has traditionally been a party for those who seek to increase their agency through a common membership or shared identity, such as labour unions, which suggests that those individuals that support agency do not have as high a sense of their own efficacy and instead work as a collective. These theoretical observations allow me to generate two hypotheses for vote choice. H2. Agency will have a negative and statistically significant effect on voting for the Labour Party. H3, agency will have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for the Conservative Party. Communion, with the sense of interdependence, integration, personal obligation, and of embedding oneself within a collective, is a value found within the historical perspective of the Labour Party. This collectivist value is not traditionally associated with the Conservative Party. Informed by this theory, two further hypotheses can be tested. H4, communion will have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for the Labour Party. H5, communion will have a negative and statistically significant effect on voting for the Conservative Party. Statistical analyses in this section are guided by the models of vote choice used by Clark et al. The analyses replicate as much as possible Clark et al.'s model of vote choice, first with the socio-demographic measure of sex and then with the measures of sex and gender. Clark et al. Conducted their analyses on those respondents who indicated they voted in the election. I conduct my analysis only on those voters who indicated they would vote if an election were held that day. Clark et al. Analyzed the vote choice dependent variable as a four-category variable of vote Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, or other. Their analysis, Model A, uses a binomial logit analysis in which the dependent variable is Labour versus other parties. In Model B, they use multinomial logistic regression to analyze conservative, liberal Democrat, and other voters with labor voters as the reference category. My analysis, due to space and time constraints, is limited to a comparison of those respondents who, 1, reported they would vote, and 2, reported they would vote for Labor versus all other parties. Excuse me. I then analyzed the same models, but substituted a dependent variable of self-reported conservative voters versus other voters. As the dependent variable is dichotomous, I used logistic regression instead of multinomial regression to compare Labor voters and conservative voters to all other voters in my analysis. In the next section, I first review the theories of models of vote choice as operationalized by the British election study team. Then I replicate the models as much as possible in a composite model using my own data. And finally, I analyze the results of when including sex and gender variables in my replicated models of self-reported Labor and conservative voters. And I need another tea break. I might have to quit after this section just because I've noticed that my voice gets worse the longer I go, and so to keep it fresh, I might have to just stretch this out over a few days rather than have a right good go at cranking out a lot in this chapter today. So that I'm not coughing at you guys. I'm trying to think of what's nicer to listen to, and I don't think me coughing down the screen at you is very nice. Models of electoral choice. The final series of models replicated in this chapter are based upon the rival models of electoral choice from Chapter 4 of Political Choice in Britain. Clark et al. Compare the results of 5 rival models of electoral choice: party identification, issue proximity, economic voting, issue performance, and party leaders. Using the variables in my dataset, I replicate 2 of these models, party identification and economic voting, use a proxy measure for issue proximity, left-right self-placement, and include the measures used in the sociological model as control variables. These individual models are combined to form a composite model for each dependent variable, and the results are displayed below in tables 4.4 and 5. I begin by specifying the sociological model. Clark et al. Begin with a test of the sociological model. As noted above, the theoretical bases for this model are the importance of an individual's social context, characteristics, and psychology. The models the authors create can be restated as voting Labor or conservative is some function of the effect of somebody's age, plus their class, plus their ethnicity, plus their gender, plus whether or not they own a home or rent, plus whether they work in the private or public sector, plus the effect of where they live in terms of their regionality. Insofar as it is possible, I've replicated the above model with variables from the exploratory dataset. The replicated model can be expressed as voting is some function of a constant plus the effect of age, class, ethnicity, being a woman, having a home versus not, and where you live in the region, and then model 2 includes all the gender measures. Partisan identification measures the degree to which an individual identifies themselves as a member or closer to a specific political party. This can be a powerful measure in accounting for the variance in vote choice. Party identification has played a central role in the analysis of political behavior since its development in the United States, and use in Britain by Butler and Stokes. The results of Clark et al.'s partisanship model indicated that identifying with the Labor Party had a positive and statistically significant effect, while identifying with other parties has a negative and statistically significant effect. These three variables produced a McFadden's R-squared of 0.38 in the British election study team's analysis. My model 1, A and B, uses only those respondents who indicated they would vote at the next general election and includes 3 measures of partisan identification to predict vote choice, such that voting equals some for constant plus the effect of Labor identification, the effect of Conservative Party identification, the effect of Lib Dem Party identification, being a woman, and also the gender measures. The BES team models the explanatory effects of issue proximity measures. Issue proximity measures estimate the political distance between an individual and the parties and rests upon the following well-established political theories. 1, there exists an underlying left-right political spectrum upon which the parties may be located. 2, voters will support the parties that lie closest to their left-right location in political space. 3, parties will attempt to locate themselves along that left-right spectrum in such a way as to attract the maximum number of individuals. To create the issue proximity model, the BES team evaluated and summed absolute difference between a respondent and the Labour, Conservative, and Liberal Democrat parties on the left, right, and tax spend scales. They found that issue proximity to Labour had a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for Labour, and issue proximity to other parties had a statistically significant negative effect on voting Labour. Their model produced a McFadden's R squared of 0.10. My dataset does not contain measures to replicate the BES issue proximity measures. I therefore attempt to model this aspect of political behavior spatially, using the respondent's own left-right self-placement on a 1 to 7 scale. The intention is to control for any explanatory effects that can be accounted for by a politically left-leaning individual voting for the Labour Party or right-leaning individual voting for the Conservative Party. Without the ability to replicate their measures exactly, I included our left-right self-placement and our tax spend questions, which asked, in politics, people sometimes talk about parties and politicians as being on the left or right. On a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 means left and 7 means right, where would you place yourself on this scale? The coding was such that 1 was far left and 8 was far right, and so the more to the left a respondent placed him or herself, producing a negative coefficient, the more likely they were to vote Labour. The tax and spend question wording was, suppose the government had to choose between the following 3 options. Which do you think it should choose? 1, reduce taxes and spend less on health, education, and social benefits. 2, keep taxes and spending on these services at the same level as now. Or 3, increase taxes and spend more on health, education, and social benefits. My model simply uses the score a respondent provided on a question of left-right self-placement in political space and the measure of political left and right to produce the following equation. Voting is some function of a constant plus their score on the left-right scale, their score on the tax spend scale being a woman, and their gender scores, and all the other demographic variables, I should say. The next model tested by the principal investigators of the British election study used economic voting variables, which included prospective and retrospective national economic evaluations, prospective and retrospective personal economic evaluations, evaluations of the Labour Party's performance on the economy, plus 1 variable based in the respondents' emotional reaction to the national economy, and 1 on their personal economic conditions. The role of economic evaluations in accounting for vote choice was established early in British political science, although the importance of the public perception of the specific issue economic competence has been replaced by the importance of public perception on issues of public services in the 2001 election. Economic evaluations are still important variables when accounting for vote choice. In all, their economic model produced a McFadden's R squared of 0.27, and almost every measure produced positive and statistically significant coefficients, with the exception of measures on prospective personal economic evaluations and emotional reactions to the national economic evaluations. 1 variable in their analysis produced a significant negative coefficient, emotional reactions to the respondents' personal economic conditions. Although I cannot replicate the entire BES model, I am able to test the 4 measures of economic evaluations in my model, where voting for Labour or the Conservative will be some function of a constant plus their score on the retrospective evaluations, prospective personal evaluations, their national retrospective evaluations, and prospective evaluations, the effect of being a woman or not, and their gender scores. Composite model. The model I have used to test the effect of sex and gender on Labour versus other voters is a composite model. This model pits measures from each of the theoretical narratives against each other in order to evaluate which variables can offer explanations for voting Labour when controlling for the explanatory effects of all the other variables in the model. The results of the 2001 British elections team's composite model produced a McFadden's pseudo R square of 0.58. Drawing upon theory and previous findings, my results should mirror the BES results such that 1. Identifying with a party should have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for that party while decreasing the likelihood of voting for any other party. 2. Positive economic evaluations should have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for the incumbent government. And 3, respondents who place themselves to the left side of the political spectrum should be more likely to vote for Labour and less likely to vote for any other party. Those who place themselves on the political right should vote for the Conservatives and be less likely to vote for any other party. The BES investigators test all of the rival models of electoral choice in a tournament of models, which I also replicate as much as possible in tables 4.4 and 5 below. In each of my analyses, I include the sociological measure of sex, model 1, and then sex and gender, model 2. To determine if sex and gender as separate variables can increase our understanding of vote choice after controlling for the explanatory effects of partisanship, economic evaluations, and left-right political perspectives. Pause for tea. Where voting is some function of the constant plus the effect of age and being a member of a minority religion and being woman in the region, and if you have an ABC1 status in your economic status, whether you have a home, whether you have a Labor ID, a Conservative ID, a Lib Dem ID, your left-right score, your personal retrospective evaluation, prospective on the economy, your national retro and prospective, and then also in model 2, the effect of the gender measures. So it's a big model. These models will test the hypotheses 2 to 5. For convenience, I restate these hypotheses here. H2, agency will have a negative and statistically significant effect on voting for the Labour Party. H3, agency will have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for the Conservative Party. H4, communion will have a positive and statistically significant effect on voting for the Labour Party. H5, communion will have a negative and statistically significant effect on voting for the Conservative Party. When my model 1 is run on the dependent variable vote Labour, it produces a pseudo R-square measure on par with the BES team's result of 0.58, with the variance in Labour vote choice explained by my variables ranging from between 0.50 and 0.71. The only variables which remain statistically significant, controlling for all other variables, are the 3 measures of partisanship, left-right self-placement, and the national economic measures. All of these coefficients are in the predicted directions and consistent with my previous results. The sex variable is insignificant in this model. The inclusion of gender variables in the model does not improve the model fit, and all of the gender measures fail to achieve statistical significance. This result is evidence against H2 and H4. So you can see that when you, and this is just, I think, pretty typical. Whenever you start to try to explain party choice, vote choice with people's partisan identification, these variables are so linked up that it explains a lot of the variance right off the bat. So there's not a lot of variance left to explain. That's why trying to connect sex differences to actual turnout or vote choice is so difficult, because there's actually not a causal mechanism that really links our hormones to voting for the Democrats or voting for the Green Party or voting for UKIP, you know. So people who think that biology is closely connected to politics just haven't really looked into it that much, or tried to test it. That's what they have not tried to do. Getting back to the text, in their composite model, the BES team used a multinomial logit to predict voting for the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, and other parties, with Labour as the reference category. In their analysis, this composite model accounted for approximately 58% of the variance in voting Conservative. My replicated composite model for the Conservative vote choice produces a high pseudo R-square range on par with the results of the British election study team. In the Conservative vote choice results, age is statistically significant and negative, suggesting that after controlling for all of the other explanatory variables, younger people in this dataset were more likely to support the Conservative Party. The only regional variable which remained statistically significant was the measure for Scotland, which reduced the likelihood of voting Tory. In Model 1, home ownership is associated with voting for the Conservative Party. All of the partisan identification variables are highly significant and in the predicted directions. Left-right self-placement remains significant. Being to the political right is associated with supporting the Conservative Party, .28. None of the economic vote measures achieve statistical significance in the composite model, and neither does the measure of biological sex. Inclusion of the gender variables in Model 2 does not improve the overall fit of the model. It still ranges from 0.47 to 0.66. Including the gender measures renders the home ownership variable insignificant, but the two measures of interest to this thesis, agency and communion, fails to achieve statistical significance in the composite model. This is evidence against H3 and H5. However, the emotional vulnerability measure does have a statistically significant relationship with Tory voting, and the relationship is positive, suggesting that higher levels of emotional vulnerability are associated with voting Conservative. The emotional vulnerability variable is statistically significant even after controlling for powerful explanatory variables, such as partisanship and left-right self-placement. Given the lack of any theoretical framework from which emotional vulnerability could be predicted to be associated with right-leaning vote choice, this result is surprising. I move now to a discussion of a possible explanation for this link between emotional vulnerability and conservative vote choice. It will be recalled from Chapter 2 that Spence and Helmrich characterized the emotional vulnerability dimension of their gender measures as, quote, the MF scale, which contained both agentic and communal characteristics, many of the latter seeming to refer to emotional vulnerability, for example, feelings easily hurt, unquote. In my analysis, the questions selected to capture emotional vulnerability included 1, not at all excitable in a major crisis, 2, very excitable in a major crisis, indifferent to others' approval, to highly needful of others' approval, and never cry, to cry very easily. My decision to include the emotional vulnerability measures was based on the recommendation of Ward et al., who wrote that the quote, EMV could be useful for explaining sex differences in other behaviors, for instance, interest, attitude, preference, and abnormal behaviors. Even when sex differences are not the primary focus, it may be important to control for EMV in studies of agency and communion, for example, in relation to mental and physical health. Thus, further research to develop the sex differentiating aspects of the EMV seems warranted. The EMV coefficient's statistical significance, when included in the composite vote choice analysis, after controlling for the explanatory effects of the big hitters in political behavior, partisan identification, and left-right self-placement, brings attention to this particular measure in relation to conservative vote choice. What could explain this observation that emotional vulnerability provides a consistent, positive, and statistically significant contribution in accounting for conservative vote choice? So just to look at it here, you can see, that when including this, you got the gender measure, it's highly statistically significant. And these are all of the standardized variables. It's a logistic regression, so these are the B's and their standard errors. But you can see other ones have bigger. The coefficients here are much bigger, like conservative ID in terms of predicting conservative voting. Obviously, it has a really huge and powerful explanatory power. But this is still statistically significant. And that's what I'm trying to understand here. My speculation as to the possible causal mechanism which connects emotional vulnerability to conservative voting is based upon recently published, something recently published which may point to what this variable measures. A recent study by Oxley et al. Presents experimental findings from work conducted in the United States in which participants who had classified themselves as having strong left or right political beliefs were connected to machines monitoring their physiological reactions to stimuli. This monitoring included measuring skin conductance and oculi startle blink reactions. The respondents were shown threatening images on a computer screen, a spider, a bloodied face, and maggots in an open wound, and played startling sounds through their headphones. Oxley et al. Found that participants who held liberal views on issues of immigration, pacifism, and gun control had measurably lower physical sensitivities to these images and to sudden noises, while participants who held conservative views, including defense spending, capital punishment, and the Iraq War, displayed measurably higher physical reactions. From this, Oakley et al. Concluded that, quote, the degree to which individuals are physiologically responsive to threat appears to indicate the degree to which they advocate policies that protect the existing social structure from both external outgroup and internal norm violator threats, unquote. It is possible that the PAQ measures of emotional vulnerability could be capturing the psychological paradigm of conservative voting individuals who are more physiological responsive and who therefore report higher emotional intensities than their liberal counterparts. At this point, I can only speculate that there may be a connection between the consistency of the EMV coefficients within my own analysis and the pattern found by Oxley et al. If it is the case that gendered measures can be used as a proxy for the physiological responsiveness of individuals, then this would be of immeasurable use in political psychology and in political analysis as attempts to explain individuals' political attitudes and behaviors. To test this hypothesis, future research would need to combine the PAQ with a replication of the Oxley et al.'s experiment to determine if emotional vulnerability is also associated with physiological responsiveness and conservative attitudes. Further replication and experimentation would determine whether my results using the EMV measure on conservative voting are mirrored in other samples or simply the artifact of this particular dataset. Well, now we're at the conclusion, so it seems kind of silly to end now. So let's see how much nattering on do I do? That's not so much. All right, let's just get it done. I'm really on a kick to try to like get through things. I want to get through this. After this, I want to get through Karen. I want to like clear my to-do list on YouTube for a while. So pardon me, I'm just going to have a quick sip of my comforting tea and then we'll get right back into it. All right, I'm going to try not to cough at you guys. Conclusion. This chapter has covered a lot of statistical results, and therefore it is important to summarize the main findings produced by all of this data analysis before locating their implications within the larger overall narrative. Given the theoretical connections between agency and self-expression through intention to vote, the first section of this chapter focused exclusively on the role of agency in intention to vote. These results are not, of course, able to speak to what role a high sense of agency actually plays in voter turnout in the British voting population generally, since this survey was conducted long after or before another general election, and their inclusion in an election survey would provide a more accurate assessment. What conclusions, then, do these exploratory intention to vote results suggest regarding the relationship between sex, gender, and an individual's predisposition toward voting? Given the small role sex plays in turnout, I began this chapter with a bold hypothesis, H1, agency scores as measured by the subset of the personal attributes questionnaire that is included in this dataset will produce positive statistically significant coefficients when they are included in an intention to vote model. Insofar as I was able to replicate the models used by Clark et al., agency was a positive and statistically significant factor in 2 out of the 3 models analyzed, the equity, fairness, and cognitive mobilization models. The model in which agency was not statistically significant, civic volunteerism, included measures of partisan identification, which, as was demonstrated again later in the composite models, a powerful predictor variable. Given the results of the analysis of intention to vote, with 2 of the 3 models tested supporting H1, I conclude there is partial evidence to support the proposal that the higher an individual's sense of their own agency, regardless of their biological sex, the more likely they are to indicate they would vote if an election were held on the day they completed the survey. Findings also suggested that when both sex and gender are significant in an intention to vote model, as they were in the equity fairness model, the biological measure of sex and the measures of gender contribute distinct explanatory information for an individual's propensity to vote. However, the inclusion of measures of strength of partisan getting a bit tired here. However, the inclusion of measures of strength of partisanship into the model, table 4.2, had the effect of making all the variables of interest statistically insignificant. As any properly specified model of turnout would include partisan identification and or strength of partisan identification in it, I cannot conclude that any of these measures have a direct effect on the intention to vote. In the next chapter, I will explore how the relevant measures relate to partisanship. Really starting to cough a lot now. The second section of this chapter examined the roles of sex and gender in vote choice. Drawing upon relevant theories, hypotheses were generated to test the idea that high communion and low agency were associated with support for the Labour Party, and that high agency and low communion were associated with a respondent indicating they would vote for the Conservative Party. A composite model using the theoretical frameworks of party identification, issue proximity, economic voting, and a sociological model produced results which showed neither sex nor gender are statistically significant when predicting partisan vote choice. However, given the explanatory power of partisanship in particular, this result is not too surprising. The non-significant results of the gender measures in the composite conservative vote choice model is evidence against H2 and H3. So close to finishing, so close. Right. When the composite model was used to analyze conservative vote choice, the two main variables of interest, agency, and communion were again statistically insignificant. This result is in line with the labor analysis in which partisanship measures were included. This result is evidence against H4 and H5. Surprisingly, given the lack of theoretical operationalization for this concept in either psychology or in political science, emotional vulnerability proved to be statistically significant in the composite model for conservative vote choice models. Considering the explanatory power of the other variables included, this result is worth considering in some greater detail. Although the results presented in this chapter have opened a potentially significant area of research, my primary concluding observation is that the demographic variable sex, in and of itself, has little ability to increase our understanding of either intention to vote behavior or vote choice. The main purpose of this doctoral research has been to investigate whether or not sex and gender should be operationalized as separate variables when accounting for political behavior. The answer based upon these preliminary conclusions as outlined above is yes. Having established that one's gendered perspective separate from one's biological sex offers unique information in explaining political behavior, the next chapter turns to the question of political attitudes, to investigate if, where, and to what extent the concepts of sex and gender can help social researchers to better understand political attitudes. All right, that is it. I'm done. I can't believe I actually managed to talk through all of those models. That was a lot of dry work. But I hope you guys, for the hardcore people who are actually watching this series, I hope you guys found that interesting and actually kind of previewing ahead since I've got you on the line. I think I'm going to just go ahead and show you some of the results of future, what we're going to be covering in the next chapter, because what one finds when we look at how well sex and gender predict political attitudes like left-right self-placement. You can see here that in Model 1, it's a simple socio-demographic variable because I really want to pit these two possible explanations against each other, controlling for all the other possible demographic or sociological influences on their lives. And you can see here that in terms of left-right self-placement, in the first model, sex is statistically significant, but when you include measures for gendered perspectives, it stops being statistically significant in terms of its ability to explain people's left-right self-placement. Moving on, we look at socialist laissez-faire attitudes. And what you find again in here, I'm spending time explaining how I'm constructing the dependent variable, you get an opportunity to see, yeah, again, here we have this variation that without the gendered measures, people would attribute to the difference of being a man and woman. But when you include how agentic or communal a person is, well, suddenly their sex stops mattering again in terms of whether or not they're a capitalist or a socialist. And it's actually these agency and communion measures which are doing a much better job of predicting this. And in fact, if you look at the betas in these models, female comes out as the strongest contributor toward explaining the variance in the first model. And it's rated, again, you order these betas from largest to smallest and you ignore the sign of the coefficient in front of it. So 9 is the biggest number in this table. Well, when you include gendered measures, one, you increase the amount of variance explained and you get the gendered measures actually explaining the variance in this, and sex stops being significant. So as I said, chapter 4 was really setting the bar high. I was trying to find a direct relationship between somebody's attitude, gendered perspective, and whether or not they were going to turn out, they said they were going to turn out to vote. That's just really difficult to find a biological causal mechanism. that has to do with hormones or something. That's there's biological mechanisms, and then there's sociological influences, and then there's these individual gendered things. There's a lot of ways that we can account for the variance in how men and women behave without referencing just to their biology. There's a lot of other things about people than just whether or not they have a penis or a vagina that informs their worldview and how they see things. So as we'll see when we come on to chapter 5, it's going to be much easier to find a correlation, or actually a causal connection here, between agency and communion and people's political preferences. So we have that to look forward to for you geeks who actually look forward to this kind of stuff. And I think that's really about it. I can't actually believe we managed to crank through all the way through chapter 4 on my throat. That is just pretty impressive. All right, guys, I'm going to go stop talking now because my throat hurts. But thanks for listening. Thanks for your time and attention. And yeah, I'll be back with something from Karen, finishing up the Karen thing this week, I'm hoping. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Bye.